The school principal called me at 6:15 in the morning. I was shocked because we didn't have children. He asked if my wife had mentioned the meeting. I said she hadn't. He went quiet for a few seconds, then asked me to come alone. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. Thank you so much for joining Voxa Stories. I appreciate note, this narrative features fictionalized details for creative and educational purposes. Similarities to actual names or events are coincidental, but the message carries clear value. I'm 41 years old and I work as a logistics manager for a regional freight company outside Denver. The kind of steady, unglamorous job that pays the bills and rarely surprises me. My wife Elaine works as a labor and delivery nurse, 12-hour shifts, the kind of exhausting, emotionally demanding work that means our house runs on a strange rotating schedule most people would find hard to keep up with. We've been married 9 years, no kids of our own, a decision we made together early on after some difficult conversations about her demanding hours and my own hesitation, something we'd made peace with a long time ago. So when my phone rang at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, an unfamiliar number, and a man introduced himself as Principal Daniel O.C. from Ridgemont Academy, a private school I'd never once set foot in, my first thought was that he had the wrong number entirely. I told him as much politely, explaining we didn't have children, and he must have the wrong family. There was a pause on his end, brief but noticeable, the kind of hesitation that told me he was recalibrating something in real time. He asked if my wife, Elaine Foster, had mentioned a meeting scheduled for that morning. I told him she hadn't said anything to me about any meeting, at any school, ever. He went quiet again, longer this time, and I heard him exhale slowly before he said, "I think it would be best if you came in this morning, alone if possible. There are some things that need to be discussed in person." I sat on the edge of my bed for a solid minute after that call ended, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of, and finding none of them reasonable at all. Elaine had left for her shift at the hospital around 10 the night before, and wasn't due home until later that afternoon. I texted her, kept it vague, just asked if everything was okay, and got no response for almost 40 minutes, an eternity when your mind is already spinning through worst-case scenarios at 7 in the morning. I drove to Ridgemont Academy, still not entirely sure what I was walking into. The school itself was nicer than I expected, the kind of tuition-heavy private academy I'd never had any reason to think about before that morning. Principal Osei met me in the front office personally, a calm, measured man in his 50s, and led me back to a conference room where a woman I didn't recognize was already seated, a folder open in front of her. She introduced herself as Renee Castillo, a caseworker with the county's Child Protective Services Division. That's when the room started tilting slightly for me, the way it does when your brain hasn't caught up yet to information your body's already reacting to. Over the next 30 minutes, I learned that my wife had a nephew named Milo, 10 years old, the son of her younger sister, Kayla. I knew Kayla existed, obviously. We saw her maybe twice a year at holidays, but I knew almost nothing about her actual day-to-day life. Only the vague, uncomfortable sense that Elaine's family treated conversations about Kayla the way you treat a bruise everyone silently agreed not to press on. What I didn't know, what apparently nobody outside a small circle knew, was that Kayla's struggles with alcohol had escalated significantly over the past 2 years, and that Elaine, rather than let her nephew fall through whatever cracks their family's silence had created, had quietly stepped in as his secondary emergency contact and, more significantly, had been paying Milo's private school tuition out of her own separate savings account for almost 2 full years. Renee explained gently but directly that this wasn't the first time she'd been involved with the family. There had been 2 prior welfare checks at Kayla's apartment over the past year, both times resulting in safety plans rather than removal, largely because Elaine had stepped forward each time as a stable, verified relative willing to take temporary custody if things escalated further. Paperwork Elaine had apparently signed and filed without ever once mentioning it to me. That morning, Kayla had shown up at the school before opening hours, visibly impaired, attempting to pull Milo out of class entirely and take him somewhere she wouldn't specify, telling the front office staff she was moving to Arizona with him by the weekend. Staff had followed, protocol contacted the county, and Renee, reviewing Milo's emergency file, had found Elaine listed as primary secondary guardian, with my name listed underneath hers as a spousal contact, which was apparently standard practice for guardianship paperwork. Listing the guardian's spouse, even if that spouse had no idea the paperwork existed. I sat in that conference room trying to process 2 years of my marriage rearranging itself in real time. 2 years of Elaine coming home some nights quieter than usual, and me assuming it was just the hospital, just another hard shift, another difficult delivery. 2 years of small, unexplained withdrawals from an account I'd always assumed was her personal savings cushion. Something I'd never questioned because we'd always kept some financial independence in our marriage. A boundary we'd agreed on early after some rocky arguments about money in our first 2 years together. Arguments that had started, ironically, because I'd once pressured her to help cover a loan for my own brother that never got repaid. Something that still occasionally came up when we argued about trust and money. I called Elaine from the school parking lot the moment the meeting ended. She picked up on the second ring, her voice thick with exhaustion from an overnight shift. And I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I was at Ridgemont Academy and she needed to come now. The silence on her end told me she already understood exactly what that meant. She arrived 40 minutes later, still in scrubs, and the moment she saw me standing in that office, something in her face broke open. 2 years of quietly carrying something alone, finally cracking under the weight of being seen. She told me everything, right there, with Renee and the principal still in the room. She told me their parents had always treated Kayla differently, even as adults, always making excuses, always sending money when Kayla just needed a little help, always framing Elaine's stability and responsibility as somehow less remarkable simply because it didn't require anyone to worry. When Kayla's drinking started affecting Milo, their parents' response had been to quietly hand Kayla more money, believing financial stress was the root cause. Money that Elaine strongly suspected was going toward exactly the problem it was meant to solve, rather than address the actual danger their grandson was living in. Elaine said she hadn't told me because she was terrified I'd see it as another version of the fight we'd had over my brother's loan. Terrified I'd tell her to step back, to let her parents or the system handle it. And she couldn't bear the idea of choosing between protecting her nephew and protecting our marriage from another money argument. So she'd quietly built a private safety net instead. Tuition payments, emergency contact paperwork, occasional overnight stays at our place that she'd always explained away as helping Kayla out for a night, never once telling me the actual scope of what she'd been managing. Before I tell you what happened over the following weeks, I want to ask you something, because this is the part I've genuinely struggled to land on an answer for. If your spouse had quietly been protecting a family member in crisis for 2 years, financially and legally, without ever telling you, would you feel betrayed that they didn't trust you enough to include you? Or would you understand why someone might carry something that heavy alone rather than risk a fight over money changing what they were willing to do? I still don't fully know where I land on that myself, and I'd genuinely like to hear how you'd feel in my position. What happened next moved faster than I expected. Because of that morning's incident at the school, Renee's office moved for an emergency temporary custody order, and given Elaine's already established relationship with Milo and the extensive documentation of her involvement over the past 2 years, the court granted us temporary guardianship within 5 days, pending a full hearing. I remember the first night Milo actually stayed with us under that order, sitting at our kitchen table doing homework like it was the most normal thing in the world, while Elaine and I exchanged a look over his head that said everything neither of us had said to each other in 2 years. The harder part was Elaine's parents. When they learned what had happened, their initial reaction wasn't gratitude toward their daughter for stepping in where they'd failed to. It was defensiveness on Kayla's behalf, insisting the school and the county were overreacting, that Kayla just needed one more chance to get things together. Elaine, for the first time in her adult life, as far as I could tell, told her parents directly that their pattern of protecting Kayla from consequences had nearly cost Milo his safety, and that she wasn't willing to hand him back into an unstable situation just to keep the family peace they'd been chasing his entire childhood. Her father didn't speak to her for almost 6 weeks after that conversation. Her mother came around slightly faster, showing up one evening with an apology that was more about missing her grandson than about acknowledging what she'd allowed to happen. But Elaine took it, imperfect as it was, because rebuilding something with her parents mattered to her, even if it happened on much narrower terms than before. Kayla entered an outpatient program about 2 months later. Partly, I think, because the reality of losing custody entirely finally cut through denial that money alone had never managed to touch. Milo still lives with us now, going on 7 months, and we're in the process of formalizing longer-term guardianship while Kayla works towards supervised reunification. A slow, uncertain process none of us pretend has a guaranteed happy ending yet. What stays with me most from that entire morning isn't the shock of learning about a nephew I barely knew, or even the strange disorientation of realizing my wife had been living a second, hidden chapter of responsibility for 2 years. It's the exact moment in that conference room when Elaine finally let herself be seen carrying something she'd convinced herself she had to carry alone. And watching relief move across her face when I didn't ask her why she hadn't told me, but simply asked her what she needed from me now. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me honestly. Would you have wanted your spouse to tell you immediately about something like this? Or do you think there are situations a person genuinely needs to handle quietly first before bringing someone else in? I read every comment, and I want to know how you'd have reacted standing in that school office the way I did. And if you want to hear the next one, about a man who discovered his own father had been secretly cutting him out of the family business for years while praising him to his face, that story's coming next. And it's one of the most quietly devastating ones I've come across. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.